what do you think about the current environment?
I think in one word, it's brutal. It is brutal out there right now, and it is a roller coaster. It's just all over the place. Things have um, the overall narrative and the market sentiment has shifted so much over the last 9 months. It's
Yeah.
pretty wild.
And can you like kind of digging into a little bit more depth or trying to unpack some of this, the brutal part aspect
Yeah,
of the environment?
definitely.
Is it,
Right.
what do you think? Because I have also heard, from a fundraising perspective, I know people are having more challenges. I think that I have heard from a lot of big companies that they're shifting more budget towards existing games that are, currently operating versus new game development. And so,
Right.
from your perspective, what is that? What does brutal mean? What are the
Yeah.
specific
Well,
impacts?
I think what's so challenging about it right now is just how much instability and uncertainty there is in the
Mhm.
marketplace right now.
Yeah.
So I think clearly the biggest thing that we're seeing is continued effects from Apple's ATT policy. And that has wreaked a lot of havoc in the industry. We're seeing, of course, the end of the pandemic bump. So overall, the market, after over a decade of amazing growth, it shrunk for the first time. So it's getting that much harder to grow. And this is at the tail end of what we had a year ago, which was this euphoria in the marketplace with
Right.
crazy deals all over the place. So it's that much harder now, and we'll talk about the UA that's harder and finding a foothold in the market, why that's so hard. But all of that um, was such an about face from where we were a year ago.
Right. And then in terms of like, well, you're currently at FunCraft. You also
Yeah.
start Juicebox Games. And when you think about this current environment today versus the previous environment, is it from again, you're saying like user acquisition is more difficult. Um, is as far as if you were to compare how much easier or harder, how would you characterize that, or how would you or is there a
Yeah,
way that you could quantify it?
I would say it's a lot harder now for sure. I mean, I think the market is so sophisticated and so mature, and there are so many big players. Whereas when I started Juicebox Games back in 2012, a lot of these other companies that are massive now were just beginning then.
Right.
So Scopely, Supercell, they were at the beginning of their journeys, and now they're the big dogs in mobile. I think as well back then there wasn't this stasis in the top grossing charts. So
Yeah.
when we launched our first game, Honorbound, it within its launch month we got into top 50 grossing games. We were top 33 RPG at one point, and now that's just really not possible. It's so static up at the top. These big gaming
Right.
companies are just working on their evergreen games.
Okay. And maybe we could talk more about your specific situation. So,
Mhm.
FunCraft, could you talk about what do you do? Like, what kind of game does FunCraft develop?
Yep.
And what's the current situation with FunCraft?
Yeah, totally. Happy to. So, FunCraft, we started FunCraft 3 years ago, and our mission is we want to make daily ritual word games. So we're
Mhm.
very focused on the word genre. It's an audience that we are um, we're really happy to serve. They are a loyal group of players, and there's tons of games to be made in this space. So we think that it's a great space. We really clarified this mission over the last year, and it's been super helpful both for the team, myself, our investors. It's been really great. So we, like I said, we started it 3 years ago. We've got backing from Play Ventures, a bunch of other great gaming folks, Mark Pincus, Mike Verdu, some others, and It's been a really good journey so far. As much as I've said, it's a brutal time in the industry right now. I think we are in the best position that we've ever been in, which feels
Okay.
really great. We are, I think, the trend for so many companies and gaming startups. At the beginning, you are in this desperate race to have a business, to have a game, and that can support yourself. And up until that point, it's just a countdown to death, to your company
Sure.
going under.
Yeah.
We've gotten past that point, thankfully, with the game Wordgrams. So this is a turn-based crossword game that launched 2 years ago, and maybe um, I would say a year and a half ago, it really started to turn into a business for us, and it has continued to do so. It's continued to grow, and it's supporting us. And now it's just to be on the other side of that is such a relief. And now we're in the growing stage, and we're in the stage of, okay, this is a good solid business with amazing people, amazing team. How can we accelerate that growth?
Right. And given that well, how challenging is that given that the current market is brutal? Do you think it has to do with maybe the market settling down a little bit further or the kind of macroeconomic conditions improving? Like, does a
Yeah.
recession hurt you guys? Things like that?
Well, I think one of the things that's so tricky, and this is what's really changed, I think, about game development over the last decade, is how much more pieces go into the puzzle of game making.
Mhm.
So it's not only a game, which is incredibly complicated by itself, but it's
Yeah.
all the other dimensions of operating a live service business. So you need to have the data analysis. You need to be able to interpret that and use that as a team. That needs to be a way that the team thinks. Then you need to have the user acquisition and all of the expertise that goes in there. You need to do all the data prediction, all of the ROAS prediction, making decisions, relationships with the different ad networks. And then you have to make new creatives, and that's a whole different engine. Ad monetization as well. That's been something for the word genre. It's traditionally a low IAP genre, and being able to monetize it with ads has been something that's allowed us to grow. So it's really all of these unique strengths.
Mhm.
And when usually, if you start a game company with a few people, you may have a really good engineer, a really good product manager, a good artist. And you also need a data analyst, a marketing person, all of these other components as well. So I think building all of that and connecting all of those pieces, that's what's so daunting and takes a fair bit of time.
Okay, so is your current challenge mainly scaling the business up? And it's great to hear you kind of gotten to the other side of completing the
Yeah.
game and launching. But
Right.
okay.
So the main challenge for us is just it's a challenge along all of those dimensions. So what
Mhm.
we've seen in the history of our game and this 2-year-old game is we have periods of incredible growth followed by a plateau. And then once we hit those plateaus, we need to change something to be able to grow again. And maybe it's a great new feature in the game. Maybe it's something on the ad monetization side. Maybe it's a new UA channel, something, but that allows us to grow again. The periods where we have grown the quickest and the most is when we have two or preferably all three breakthroughs at the same time. So when you're able to do that, that allows you to you recoup faster,
Yeah.
you're able to spend more. All of the dimensions improve. So it's really I wish I could say that there's one challenge, but it's really all of those things and just connecting the whole beast of FunCraft together.
Right. And before I forget to ask you, maybe I can ask you now. You mentioned Honor Bound was at some point a
Yeah.
relatively high performing RPG, and now you're in word games. Can you talk about,
Right.
because this is a question I get asked a lot, is like, how do you
Yeah.
determine what game to make? And for you guys, what was that? driver to work on word games relative to RPGs, where presumably you had
Yeah.
more background?
Totally. So my career and my co-founder and CTO Jason McGurk, a career in games. We started together in 2009 at Zynga,
Mhm.
and we were working on Zynga Poker. So we've worked on a casino game together. We worked on Farmville together. We did a CCG together, an RPG CCG together. I went to Electronic Arts and led the studio that made Command and Conquer Rivals. So I've made a real time strategy game as well. And now I'm making word games. I think um, a lot of different genres, which I think is a real plus.
Sure.
The reason that we chose this specific genre was, and it actually, when we started FunCraft, we knew that we wanted to make smaller, classic gameplay games that we could build deeper meta games around, more live service, more social, in the style of games like Toon Blast
Mhm.
or like what we saw People Fun doing with Wordscapes. So we thought that there are these really simple, great games that they just dress up with all of this other stuff that all of these systems that we're quite familiar with from many of the games that we've worked on. So it really, the idea of smaller games started from that idea of how we wanted to approach the market. And then we launched several games and quickly found the most success with wordgrams. And as that success occurred, that encouraged us and made it clear to us that we should focus on word games even more.
Got it. And maybe to kind of drive back towards this theme around challenges, and I think that you in particular have a interesting background in the sense that, two startups, including FunCraft, which you're working on now. You mentioned you
Yeah,
were working at Zynga on, poker is a very successful product. You are
yeah,
also at EA as a studio GM, I believe. And so when you
yep,
think about, as a lot of people in this current brutal market, and a lot of people are talking about how EA is having a lot of problems, and at least on the mobile side, and Zynga is starting to find a lot of challenges. And what do you think in terms of whether it's as a startup leader or within the big company? Maybe you could talk about one, some of the biggest lessons that you've learned, and then what do you think are the specific challenges associated with a startup or a big company like a Zynga or a EA in order to try to achieve the success that is required in this kind of brutal
right,
market that you're describing?
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, for the bigger companies, I think they need to be leveraging their existing titles that are working well, and I think that's something we see them already doing, focusing on their evergreen franchises. In Zynga's case, I think the challenge that larger companies always have is launching new titles,
Mhm.
especially when the bar for a successful title is so high. So for a title to be meaningful at a Zynga or at an EA, it has to be a pretty big
Yeah.
number. And when you start marching towards um, the table stakes of that big number, that's the minimum it can do to be viable, that puts a lot of pressure that I don't think is helpful on the organization to say no to a lot of ideas and to be really confident that an idea will be that can hit that bar. And I think the reality, my experience in this business so far is just it you really need to put a lot of product out there, a lot of features, and go as fast as you can and learn from consumers rather than your opinion or my opinion, or a lot of other opinions, especially people's opinions who aren't actually making the game. I think you need to go fast and get stuff out there into players' hands. I think the goal is that yourself and myself, based on all of our market experience, that we are making the bets that based on the knowledge that we have of the market. But it's still, I'm if I hit 30%, I would be thrilled with that. That would be great.
Right. And to your point on the lack of innovation or the ability to drive new games out of a large company, I mean, we've kind of seen that.
Yeah.
That was kind of like the big knock on Zynga for a long time. And so a lot of the growth at Zynga was largely driven by M&A, Chris Petrovic over that like 5-year span
Yeah.
of just kind of acquiring a bunch of companies. Uh,
Right. Amazing.
right, and
Yeah.
with that, so no longer sort of being the case now that we're out of a 0 interest rate kind of environment and just based upon the current market, um, maybe a couple questions I can ask you is what do you think is it specifically to your point that um, that the challenge in creating a hit new game out of a company like a Zynga or a EA because of the big expectations and people are trying to rush, is that the issue, or do you think there might be other structural or cultural or political reasons why that there's this challenge at a Zynga or an EA?
Right. Well, I mean, I'm far away enough from Zynga where I don't know specifically what I'm talking about, but I can speak generally. And I know that the transition that they made, which was a part of their reboot, was they took game making out of San Francisco.
Okay,
San Francisco used to be the game making headquarters. It is no longer that, and it hasn't been that for a long time. And you're absolutely right. They just started buying the successful games, and that was the path to growth. These teams were proven, or even not the teams even their products were proven, which is a reflection of the team as well. So I think that approach has worked really well for them, and it seemed to work more recently for Electronic Arts. In the history of Electronic Arts, it seems they've made leaps with their acquisitions, though the recent ones don't seem to have
right,
borne much fruit, which
yeah,
is a real shame, I think, for everyone involved. And I don't know why that's happened, but it's a pretty dismal record so far.
right. And maybe just thinking about as a startup with FunCraft and your previous experience, can you what do you think for some of the other entrepreneurs and other gaming startups out there, what would be some, some potential lessons or basically things that you think are especially challenging for mobile gaming startups to be successful in the current environment?
Yeah.
Like you had mentioned UA, but is beyond that?
Yeah. What Yeah, I think too that I probably the one that I internalized most from Juicebox and we applied um, absolutely to FunCraft is the desire. And let me make sure I state this in the right negative way or non-negative way. We do not want to bet the company on a single game launch.
Mm,
We do not want to bet the company on each subsequent game launch. And that's what we did at Juicebox. So we went all in on the first game. The entire team was working on it, and we launched it with barely any money left in the bank. The game worked, and we got to work on that game for another year and a half. And then we worked on a second game. And when we launched that game, within 3 days, we knew we were going to have to shut the company down.
I know.
And that was a sobering moment to have literally everything dependent on the game launch, and then you see the first day installs, and you're like, "Oh my gosh, this is our we're never going to recover."
Right.
So I think making sure with FunCraft that as you build a company, you're building the team and you're building a lot of expertise along the way. And it's such a shame to throw that away, especially if you believe and we believe that not every game concept will work. So you want to set yourselves up to have multiple attempts and to keep making games. So we really structured the game approach and the type of games that we're going after. One thing that's really nice about these small casual games is frankly that they're quicker to build. They're not these your plus 30-person dev teams. We can get a game concept out pretty quickly. And that was another reason that we went after this genre
Okay.
or these types of
And
games.
when you say like don't bet the company on one game, I think the the kind of the flip side to that that I'm not a big fan of, but just working in India, so many Indian gaming companies are basically kind of the philosophy is we don't know what's going to hit, so we're going to work on 5 games or 10 games. And then in one case, there was a small team working on 20 games, and I was just like, "What are you guys doing?" um,
It's a
so,
lot,
so
right?
like, but from your perspective, when you say don't bet the farm on the one game, do you mean that in a serial context where you have the whole team work on one game and then another, or would you actually recommend startups work on multiple games simultaneously?
Well, I think it's what the team's capable of. And so we are supporting WordGrams, and we have other team members that are working on a new game concept right now. And we're probably going to spin off of another engineer to start working on another game. Again, I think because our games are relatively straightforward and we have such senior people, we're able to do that in a way that doesn't take the entire, it's not hugely
Right, right.
distracting. um, I had feedback from investors when I was first pitching this company. Gigi of NFX was like, "What do you?" He exactly what you just said. He said, "What do you mean you're working on multiple games? You need to have 100 people on this
Mm.
game. That's what happens at Playtika, and um, you need to and you need to grind the game out." And I said, I just said, thank you. That's good feedback. But also, it's like, we don't have 100 people. We can't grind the game with 100 people. We don't have that. And I think there's always such a challenge, always in games too. When do you switch from a game? When do you know a game is a loser
Yeah.
or not? Or when can you, or the other, when do you know a game is not a winner? Maybe we have abandoned some of our games too early. And had we kept working on them, maybe they could be a monster game. Clearly, I don't think that's the case, but that's possible.
And actually, I think that's a interesting question, right? And this is a situation which I think so many game companies face, which is, you know, do you keep going or do you tap out? Do you quit? And there are for every, kind of success story, there's a bunch of other stories which didn't work out. But I think one in particular is Golf Clash, right? I mean, that was a game where everybody did not think it was that great. um, so many companies passed on acquiring the company in the game because the initial metrics didn't look great. But all it really needed was a little bit more time in UA, really. So in that case, it worked out. There are other situations where there have been companies that have been
Yeah,
down to like 1 week of cash or 1 day of cash, and then just some lucky break hits, and then they make it. But and for all of those stories, there's a bunch where it's like, okay, we should have pivoted, but we stayed working on the same game. How do you think about that, Michael, in terms of keep
yeah,
going, or just pivot away, or what is your mental model on that?
right. Yeah, I think it's been different times in my
Mhm.
career where I've had to make that choice, and maybe I'll talk.
Yeah,
I'll speak about it in
please.
that way. In three
Mhm.
different instances. So when Juicebox ended and we ran out of money and our second game didn't work, I was I didn't know what to do next because I thought the game that we made would work and it was a struggle to make it and then it didn't work. And because it didn't work and like I don't know had we been given another $3 million to keep that company going, I don't know, I don't think we would have ended up in a better place because I was or not just me, but I think we were we weren't equipped to tackle the marketplace. Similarly, at EA, after the launch of Command and Conquer Rivals, for me personally, after launching that game, um, getting it through a lot of the dev cycle and a lot of the gates and the check process to it's tricky to shepherd a game through that process that doesn't necessarily make the game better or more likely to succeed, and then the game doesn't do well. Then the question is, wait a minute, do I really want to do that again with even less, with less trust and more gates? People are going to say, "Oh my goodness, we have to check, we have to help this team more. We have to help Michael out even more because it didn't work the first time." And I can't imagine what that process would have been like. I don't think we would have shipped another game. I would have shipped another game. And I want to
Right,
ship games. I want to make games. I want to work on live games. So for me, I didn't see a path to building games and building successful games there. And I saw this other opportunity to make smaller games that could succeed and grow into really, really big businesses. And that's what FunCraft was, and what FunCraft has become. Right now, why I'm so excited about the position that we're in is because we have so many ideas to make. It's not like, what do we do next? We have a roadmap of game ideas and strategic directions to go into that all build on the learnings that we
mhm.
have right now, where it's just like, oh my, we need more resources. We should be going even faster. How can we go
Right.
even faster to
So
accelerate this? So I think for me, that question is really about, it's a personal question, it's a personal decision. But if you can have conviction in your
right,
roadmap and you're excited about going to work the next day, or you're thinking about it the night before in a positive way,
right.
not in dread, then, then you're in a good position and you should keep going.
Sounds yeah, that sounds like a good way to think about it. So ultimately, it's like, do you have faith in the roadmap and the plan? If you do, you have a lot of good ideas that could potentially turn the game around, and if you do, then great. And if you don't, then maybe you should let it
Yeah.
go. And I think the funny thing too is like sometimes just staying in the game, it's for some companies and for some people, that's enough, right? Like I know a
Right.
number of companies who were about to go out of business and then COVID hit. And while COVID for a lot of people was bad, for these guys, it just drove up their revenue. And then all of a sudden they went from not being profitable to suddenly being profitable. And I would even, my
Yeah.
assumption is like, even some of the bigger companies like a Scopely was definitely benefited very significantly from COVID. But yeah, I think like yeah. Well, anyway, I do think there is some aspect exactly what you're
Yeah.
saying, and just
Right. I hear you too. Just the staying alive is really valuable.
right.
And it's like such an obvious thing to say. Not dying is
Uh-huh.
worthwhile, and it allows you to live another day. But I think, I mean, obviously, you don't want to just be limping along or
Right.
be a zombie. I think you have to believe that there's something ahead of you. And fortunately, we're in that position.
And I think another question I'd love to ask you, just a real question for you as an operator and a leader at your company. And you mentioned that you're now at a point where you've kind of launched this game; it's doing relatively well. But there's issues that we're facing. We are in a brutal environment, and maybe scaling is a little more challenging now than it was before. And who knows what the future holds? And as you think about staying in the game to see if you can scale it up. I mean, I don't know the exact sort of metrics or
Yeah.
your current financial situation, but how do you think about your current business in terms of the challenging environment that we're in, your ability to potentially, just kind of keep going, or do you have the ability to scale things up more? How are you thinking about your current business and challenges?
Yeah. Right. Well, I think we're in a really good
Mhm.
position. We raised around a year and a half ago,
Congrats. Good
and
timing.
that cash is sitting there. Thank you. It's funny when you raise around and then you read all the articles about other teams that raise rounds, and obviously you compare yourself, and maybe sometimes unfavorably, but that's the world of that we live in with all these comparisons. But now we're so pleased to have the funding that we have, and that it's been really stable over the last year. So we're not dipping into that cash.
Nice.
And that puts us in a
Right.
great position
Yes.
of
That's right.
strength,
Right.
which is great. What we also see is that we are at starting since December. We've been starting to grow the business again to some of our highest levels yet, and we see continued growth. So for us, it's a matter of okay, we're in a really great place. We have all of the infrastructure that we built last year is really benefiting us right now. And we see not only with this title, but future titles that are going to be that we'll be testing soon. So when companies have reached out and do
Mhm.
reach out to us, and I think the question is always when we're talking to these people, it's okay, what does the fit look like? The two big question is there a fit, and can these companies help us get to where we want to go more quickly? And if they can, and they believe in our strategic vision and want us to keep doing what we're doing, then we talk more, and that's interesting. But I think it's real. It's early for us, and we've got a lot of growth ahead. So I think it's. I mean, the lesson is we need to, if we're doing well, and we need to make ourselves as
Right.
interesting as possible for any of these companies. And I think the more interesting we are, the more fun it is going to be to operate the
Right.
company as well. So I know there's sometimes when I talk to the corp dev teams, they talk about other companies that they're trying to buy, and they say that these guys are so happy, they're spitting off so much cash that they have no desire to be purchased because it's such a great business for them. Our goal is to become one of those.
Okay. And Michael, just for to clarify for our audience, when you say that these companies are reaching out, I assume it's for an M&A scenario where they're thinking about acquiring your company.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
along that line of thought, I think the interesting thing in the current environment is that how one of the things you said you're thinking about is what are the synergies? Can they help you grow and things of that nature? But I think the other thing that's happened is because of the public markets and the current economic situation, valuations have come down. I know some of the bigger groups. I talked to some folks who are at some of the bigger kind of companies that are acquiring companies, and
Aggregator. Yeah.
they talk about how they do speak to a number of companies, but they want to acquire those companies at much lower valuations than from a year ago. Does
Right.
that factor into your mind? Are you like, bummer, if we would have done this a year ago, we could have gotten a much higher valuation? Or are you really like, what goes through your mind? And what do you think about just for other people in the games industry who may
Yeah.
also be considering, that kind of a
Right.
scenario?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that the value, like, there's a huge discrepancy between public valuations and private valuations right now, and the
Mhm.
multiples at the public companies is so much lower. So what they're willing to pay is not in line with what VCs may be telling a company that they're
Okay.
worth. But it turns out a company is only worth what somebody is willing to buy it for.
Yeah. Right.
It's a lot easier to say, "Oh, you're worth 100 million." Really? Okay,
Yeah.
someone who's going to pay 100 million.
All right.
So I think in situations like that, then that's a discussion and a conversation where you have to think, okay, where are we? If someone's making a credible offer, it's you have to think: can we grow? Are we confident that we can grow more than that?
Right.
And do we think the markets are going to improve? I certainly do. I think we're going to see Apple start to give some tools back, but we'll see if that happens.
And maybe just thinking about, we had talked about the current brutal market, but for the future, and when you think about free to play mobile gaming opportunities, if you're to think about giving advice to new entrepreneurs trying to make it in mobile or gaming, what advice would you give them, or what are your current thoughts about new people trying to jump in right now?
Yeah, well, I think I mean, there's different types of new people. If you're fresh to the industry and you want to get in, I think it makes sense. What I'm so thankful for my career at Zynga was just how fast paced that environment was and how much we were able to do and how much responsibility and freedom and decision making they gave to really young, fresh people in the industry. It was like the most incredible compressed learning experience that I could have imagined. I don't know where those types of companies exist, what they might be, but I encourage someone to try and find those. So try and find a team that is shipping to players. I think that's really important to have a live game experience. Then, if you were thinking about starting a company, I think the question is really getting as much conviction as you can into your game idea of how it can break through and how users will become aware of it. I think over the course of my career, I have learned and come to appreciate so much more about user acquisition and marketing, of how obviously integral that is to a game's success. How do you break through the noise when there are so many incredible titles and games out there, and so many are free to play? So I mean, if I would never start a battle royale shooter if I were a 10-person team right now. It doesn't. You're not going to be able to compete with what's out in the marketplace. So I think it's there's red oceans everywhere. So how do you find the blue one, or a pink ocean?
Right. And do you have any thoughts? Like, so you mentioned the user acquisition or marketing aspect, and at the top of our conversation, you had mentioned that had become a lot more challenging. Can you go into a little bit more depth in terms of where you think that is today and how that plays out?
Yeah. So I think it's. I mean, the challenge that we've seen, and a lot of our peers have seen, is just user acquisition is becoming. It's always the relationship between CPI and LTV, and we're seeing CPIs continue to go up, and the ROAS does not follow. So the LTV is not going up as well. So you're not buying more qualified users. They are just more expensive, which means they have to stay longer. And at a certain point, user acquisition can just become unprofitable and stop making sense for companies or for games. So I think that it's whether it's iOS not being, or iOS removing the ability to target users, that's certainly part of it, but we just can't find good users, and it's just creating pressure everywhere on the user acquisition piece. I think there's a connection to hyper casual, where it's like, how much was that really part of the ecosystem and part of this circular system going on? I don't really know the reasons, to be honest. All I know is it's gotten harder. And um, what we have had to do is work that much harder on the game side to improve our metrics to be able to grow or keep trying new channels. Things have, as I've said, we've seen them start to improve again over the last 3 months. We've also made some game improvements, but we're excited about what we're seeing and think there's going to be we think there's going to be some growth. I've talked to some Apple people, and one of them was saying that they didn't even. He was new to Apple, and he was saying how he was surprised when he brought up the havoc that these changes were wreaking, and everyone was surprised and unaware of it, was how he told me the story. And when he explained to them how bad it was and used some harsh language, it was um, they all turned on him very quickly, and it was like a protect Apple at all costs type of mentality. We're doing what's best for Apple, and never how could this matter to anyone else? So I don't know if they realize the implications that they have. Maybe they do, but we did see services revenue from Apple decline last quarter, and I think that's certainly driven by games, and so many of the other advertising businesses. So maybe they'll um, in their own interest, which is, I think, the only way that it will help us. In their only if they see it in their own interest to grow the pie again, will they give us back the tools.
And maybe like another question I can ask you then is as we're if we're kind of focused on future opportunities, I know there's been a lot of stuff that's been happening in the market in terms of like whether it's Web3 and now potential decline of Web3. There's been publishers that have tried to come on and have not been very successful. Maybe they'll make another comeback. In terms of like just the future trends or opportunities that people should be aware of, what are some of the things that you think that entrepreneurs or new mobile gaming startups should be aware of or should be watching?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think I don't have a great answer to that, or and I don't have a trick for that, other than the hard work and the hard craft that it requires. I do think that there are really amazing game makers out there that can make new types of games, and those can and do be rewarded. So when a game like Marvel Snap comes along and does so well, that's awesome to see. I think it's great as a gamer, for the business. It's great to see a fresh idea come along. I wish it were not with Marvel IP. It would be even better if it were a fresh IP, but more power to them. They used it amazingly. So I think those stories still can happen, but they also set up a lot of their. They had a lot going for them and they set it up, like, all the credit to them. I think that's the path to success, of being able to break out through that in that way. I think we're continuing to see just the power of community. And that was something that was initially, one of the more compelling things about Web3, this idea of community and advocacy. Um, so I think that's always, that's going to be a continued way to generate an audience for a game. It just needs to be done in a really authentic way.
Okay. And maybe as a final question, I can ask you about. So we've already talked about like the current environment for mobile gaming, but maybe in terms of like any final thoughts on the state of the market, perceptions of it, and your general outlook. I mean, are you more optimistic or pessimistic, or how are you thinking about it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I am I am optimistic for the industry. I'm optimistic for players. I'm optimistic for FunCraft.
Mhm.
I think it is harder than ever for new entrants to come along. I think this is, we are at, uh, uh, peak, the peak of this, not peak in terms of growth, but consolidation is clearly happening. There are monster games right now. I think it's a really daunting time to bring something, from scratch, to build something from the ground up right now. But I think for great teams, there's always opportunity.
All right, great. Well, Michael, that was all of my questions. And so maybe we could end with just like, if anyone has any follow up or questions, how can people reach you? And do you have any final words of advice or recommendations for the audience?
Yeah, please reach out on LinkedIn. Happy to respond there. And I think my my biggest recommendation is just to go do it. If you have an idea, or if you want to put something out there, take steps to make that happen, and just go out there and see what players think.
Awesome. Well, Michael, thank you so much for your time. And for our audience, we'll catch you next time. Thanks, Michael.